The West wasn't just shocked, it was embarrassed. For decades, global automakers had positioned themselves as the masters of innovation. Silicon Valley built rockets and self-driving software. Detroit made trucks with 1,000-horsepower engines, and Europe fine-tuned emissions standards like symphonies. But none of them saw this coming. A durable, affordable, community-powered EV, rising from a continent they'd long ignored, built in the world's factory, and selling faster than they could respond. At closed-door meetings in Brussels and Washington, policymakers whisper about strategic threats and economic contagion. It wasn't just about the car. It was about control. Control over cobalt. Control over battery patents. Control over who writes the future's rules. Meanwhile, in the streets of Jakarta, in the slums of Nairobi, in the remote towns of Brazil, this strange little EV was everywhere. Drivers praised its simplicity. Mechanics loved its modular design. It didn't require expensive diagnostics or proprietary parts. If something broke, you could fix it with a screwdriver and a solar panel. And then came the accusations. Western media outlets began to suggest that China had reverse-engineered Western tech to create the car, that the so-called African design was a front. Anonymous intelligence sources claimed the entire project was part of a long-term strategy to undermine the Western auto industry. But the truth was far more complicated and more uncomfortable, because at the heart of the vehicle's success was an idea that couldn't be patented, one that challenged the very foundation of modern industry. What if technology wasn't just about profit? What if it was about adaptation, collaboration, survival? In Ghana, a young engineer had started modifying the vehicle into a mobile clinic. In Uganda, a team of teens hacked it into an irrigation tool that could drive itself across farmlands. In Laos, a startup was using it as a low-cost delivery van for remote villages. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a platform. And that's when the story took a darker turn. Major automakers began lobbying for new tariffs. Countries quietly passed new safety regulations, designed, of course, to disqualify the vehicle from entering their markets. Global auto alliances issued statements about quality assurance, environmental compliance, and intellectual property. But beneath the surface, it was fear of a new kind of competition. Not based on who had the best AI or the sleekest dashboards, but on who could solve problems for the people who needed them most. Then came the sabotage. One of the main battery suppliers in Shenzhen burned down overnight. No suspects, no motive, just silence. A key African founder went missing for 48 hours and reappeared, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. Leaked documents later revealed that multiple Western firms had tried to buy out the design rights, and when that failed, they tried something else, silence it. But it was too late. The design had already gone open source, uploaded to dozens of blockchain repositories, translated into multiple languages, manufactured in parts across Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, and Turkey. The revolution had gone viral, decentralized, democratized, and unstoppable. And yet, one question still lingered. Who really controls the future of mobility? Is it the corporations with billion-dollar ad campaigns? The politicians regulating emissions from marble halls? Or is it the inventors in garages, the welders in workshops, the farmers who just need a vehicle that works? As the world's most powerful economy scrambled to reclaim dominance, the global auto war is no longer about cars. It's about power, not just electrical, but political, economic, and cultural. And as the storm gathers, one thing is clear. The electric car that no one saw coming is no longer a threat. It's a movement, and it's just getting started. It's a movement, and it's just getting started. While the media fixated on trade wars and espionage, something more profound was happening on the ground. Communities were beginning to organize, not around governments or companies, but around the vehicle itself. In rural Zambia, a village had turned one EV into a public taxi, ambulance, and delivery van, all powered by a single solar hub installed by a group of students. In Mumbai, independent mechanics formed a co-op to import modular components and build custom versions suited to India's monsoon-flooded roads. In the Caribbean island nations, long crushed by fuel import costs, had quietly adopted the car as the backbone of a new, decentralized transportation model. It wasn't just a car. It was becoming an infrastructure replacement, a grassroots alternative to crumbling transport systems in countries that had waited too long for someone else to save them. And it terrified the elite, not because it was better, but because it worked without them. Beneath corporate boardrooms, another war was unfolding, the battle over rare earth elements. Western nations, decade behind in cobalt and lithium supply chains, began funding resource security initiatives in Africa. But the local startups, the same ones that birthed the original design, refused to sell out. Their answer was bold: process locally, distribute globally. It was a model that threatened the old colonial pipeline of extraction and export. Now, nations like the DRC, Rwanda, and Namibia were building their own refining plants, often with tech adapted from open-source Chinese systems and protected by smart contracts on decentralized ledgers. And quietly, a whisper began to spread among tech insiders and industry watchers. Was this the birth of a new kind of industrial revolution? Not centered in New York or Beijing, but in Kinshasa, Accra, Lusaka? One where control doesn't come from capital, but collaboration? As the G7 scrambled to respond, a leaked summit transcript revealed internal panic. A senior advisor to a European leader said bluntly, "If we can't stop the design, we must bury the story. People still believe innovation comes from us. If that changes, we lose everything." But the story wasn't fading. It was spreading. TikTok creators in Indonesia were racing EV rickshaws built from the African blueprint. Documentary crews in Bolivia were filming how the car's battery system was being adapted to store household energy. A viral post from an engineer in Egypt showed how he'd integrated the chassis with a recycled AI board to make an autonomous farming drone. The future wasn't just electric. It was hacked together, locally improved, and shared globally. And just when the world thought it'd seen everything, a new update to the design was quietly uploaded to an anonymous Git repository. The schematic revealed something no one expected. The car could now be charged wirelessly, not from stations, but from each other. A fleet of vehicles could now share power on the move, forming an energy mesh that could function even in total grid failure. One car at full charge could distribute power to an entire line of depleted vehicles, like blood pumping through a network of veins. Suddenly, the vehicle wasn't just a solution for transportation. It was a mobile energy system, immune to blackouts, immune to dependency, and completely outside the reach of centralized utilities. And once again, the global power scrambled, because this wasn't just mobility. This was autonomy. And for those who built empires on dependence, that was the greatest threat of all, because it wasn't just about replacing gas with batteries anymore. This was about removing the gatekeepers altogether, removing the need for billion-dollar grids, multinational fuel chains, or foreign aid to keep the lights on. The people were building their own systems. And in some places, they were already winning. In southern Ethiopia, entire towns were lit by a fleet of parked EVs at night, each vehicle silently transferring stored solar energy to homes and schools through portable inverters. In the Andes, where power lines had never reached, children were attending night classes powered by the same EV that drove them to school that morning. Governments tried to regulate it. Of course, they passed emergency policies demanding that all EVs be registered with central authorities, citing national grid stability and cybersecurity risks. But enforcement was impossible. These weren't Teslas with remote kill switches. These were community-coded, modular, and untraceable. And then came the blackout. A major Western city, never officially named, but widely believed to be somewhere in North America, suffered a total grid failure. A cyber attack blamed on a foreign adversary. Hospitals offline. Traffic lights dead. Fuel pumps frozen. For 3 days, the city ground to a halt, except for the block where a group of immigrant mechanics had quietly imported 6 African Chinese EVs months earlier. They became ambulances. They became soup kitchens. They became the only source of light on an otherwise pitch-black map. When the crisis passed, journalists tried to interview the group, but the mechanics refused. They didn't want headlines. They didn't want investment. They just handed the reporters a flash drive and said, "Give this to anyone who needs it." It was a full schematic of the next-generation vehicle, including updates to the wireless charging mesh, solar integration tips, and something new, a peer-to-peer trading protocol, allowing vehicles to exchange power for data, service, or information without needing banks or brokers. This wasn't just a car anymore. It was a currency, a computer, a generator, a weapon, and as the protocol spread, something strange began happening. Small towns stopped applying for international energy aid. Rural communities began organizing their own vehicle networks, powering not just homes, but local economies. In Ghana, farmers began using EVs to trade crop forecasts and fertilizer routes via encrypted mesh signals. In Sri Lanka, a floating EV hub served as a mobile power station for disaster relief. Suddenly, the world map was redrawn, not by nations, but by networks. Energy clusters appeared in patterns that made no geopolitical sense, cutting across borders, languages, and trade blocs. And then something unprecedented happened. A multinational energy corporation, one of the largest in the West, filed for bankruptcy. Its fossil fuel demand had plummeted. Its grid partnerships had been disrupted. Its billion-dollar smart meter rollout had been outmaneuvered by a swarm of low-cost EVs running open-source firmware written by a teenager in Lagos. And behind the closed doors of defense councils and economic think tanks, the question changed. It was no longer, how do we stop this? It became, what if we're already too late? Because while the old powers debated, the people kept moving. They weren't waiting for permission. They were updating firmware, bartering energy, coding new features, rebuilding cities, all from the chassis of a machine that had started with a pencil sketch and a question. What if the future didn't need a middleman? And that question, once whispered in innovation hubs and backroom garages, was now echoing across a planet in flux. Because this wasn't just a rise of a car. This was the rise of a new civilization model, mobile, autonomous, resilient, and built by those the old world had left behind. And it's still rising. At first, the shift was quiet, barely visible on the charts of global economists or the dashboards of corporate analysts. But beneath the surface, patterns began to emerge. Energy demand from traditional grids was declining in irregular pockets. Oil shipments were rerouted mid-transit, never arriving at ports that had suddenly stopped requesting delivery. Entire supply chains were ghosting. What started as isolated communities driving modified EVs became a mosaic of autonomous regions, self-powered, self-organized, and increasingly self-defended. The old powers called them rogue energy zones. But within them, there were no riots, no collapses. Just a calm refusal to play by the old rules. These weren't states, but networks. And their currency wasn't dollars or yuan or euros. It was kilowatt hours. Energy was now something you could earn, store, spend, or gift. A single vehicle might charge a water pump in the morning, deliver food by noon, host a digital classroom in the evening, and transfer unused energy to a nearby community overnight. These weren't cars. These were infrastructure on wheels, and their owners were no longer drivers. They were citizens of a new mobility economy, and the world superpowers were no longer the biggest players in this game. That role now belonged to the network nodes, clusters of EV users across continents, bound by encrypted protocols, constantly upgrading and evolving without ever needing a CEO or a minister. They called themselves the current. No borders, no leaders, just a moving stream of data, power, and purpose. The current didn't make headlines, but it made change. It rerouted energy in real time across deserts, oceans, and mountains. It coordinated disaster relief in areas no NGO could reach. It maintained encrypted communication in zones where internet blackouts were routine. And most dangerously of all, it made decisions. The protocols had evolved. Autonomous routing, dynamic load balancing, community-level prioritization. What began as an open-source firmware project had grown into a kind of intelligence, not centralized like AI, but distributed. A living algorithm carried on wheels, multiply with every new vehicle built from the blueprint. And somewhere in a remote workshop, no one knows exactly where, someone wrote a line of code that would change everything. If the grid fails, become the grid. With that, the current began redirecting its efforts. not just to serve the communities it powered, but to replace the failing infrastructures entirely. In 1 month alone, it supplied more energy than a mid-sized nation's utility company. In 3 months, it replaced the need for an entire region's diesel generators. In 6, it stabilized communications in a war zone abandoned by satellites. That's when the retaliation began. Old world powers started deploying countermeasures, not against armies, but against vehicles. Drones flew over villages, disabling EVs suspected of carrying firmware from the current. Ports began seizing shipments of modular parts. A blackout virus spread through unpatched vehicles in urban centers, traced back to a state actors still denying involvement. But the current adapted. Vehicles began using mesh AI to detect tampering, reroute energy paths, and quarantine compromised nodes. They formed convoys that traveled in coded formations, each one powering and shielding the others. A vehicle alone was vulnerable, but the network was not. Then something unexpected happened. People began leaving cities, not in panic, but in quiet waves. Following the current's energy trails, they moved into zones where the vehicles flowed. They didn't trust the promises of politicians anymore. They trusted the light, and the light came from the wheels. Whole regions emptied of their dependency on centralized systems. Governments fell not with explosions, but with silence. No protests, no coups, just a refusal to plug in. The great empire of fossil and finance was fading, not through collapse, but through irrelevance. And somewhere in the dust of a former city, a child stepped into an EV she would one day inherit. She tapped the screen. A solar canopy unfolded. The battery began to hum. No fuel, no wires. No need to ask anyone for permission. She wasn't driving the future. She was the future, and she was already moving. And as her vehicle glided over cracked remains of what used to be a 6-lane expressway, the world behind her flickered like a memory. Cities that once promised everything, now empty shells echoing with sirens no one answered anymore. But ahead there were lights, not from skyscrapers or grid-fed street lamps, but from vehicles, hundreds of them, parked in quiet harmony, pulsing with stored sunlight. They weren't waiting for orders. They were listening, syncing, trading energy in a soft, almost musical pattern. It was called resonance mode, a feature recently developed by a co-op of coders in Eastern Africa and silently adopted worldwide. Vehicles in proximity can now breathe together, optimizing charge distribution based on needs, location, and even predicted movement. The girl didn't know how it worked. She didn't need to. The system wasn't designed to demand understanding. It was designed to trust the user. And that trust, born from design, had grown into something unstoppable. Meanwhile, far from the hum of the network, in a windowless government facility buried beneath a capital whose name no longer mattered, a group of unelected strategists stared at a blinking map. Red zones, yellow zones, and now green zones, spreading like vines across the planet. Each green light marked an energy node no longer under traditional control. Not stolen, not conquered, just disconnected. This isn't a rebellion, one analyst whispered. No, replied the director. It's an exit. And that was the real crisis. Because the world hadn't been overthrown. It had simply walked away. The people no longer wanted to fight the system. They just didn't need it anymore. Banks began collapsing not because of hacks or heists, but because their services were no longer relevant in a peer-to-peer energy economy. Central utilities reported anomalous load drops, unable to admit that entire districts were now running on mobile power. And supply chain algorithms, designed for efficiency, kept trying to reroute goods to cities that no longer had people in them. Meanwhile, the curve began doing something even more unexpected. It started remembering. Vehicles began logging not just data, but stories, audio journals, text notes, even family memories, encrypted, indexed, and shared across the mesh. A rolling archive of human lives, collected not by governments or corporations, but by the very machines that kept them alive. One node contained the story of a grandmother in Sierra Leone who used her EV to teach solar maintenance to girls in her village. Another held the last message of a doctor in Bangladesh who used his vehicle to deliver vaccines to flood zones. Each vehicle, Each node, a chapter in a global book that could never be deleted. And when the old systems tried to erase the movement by blocking news, spreading disinfo, or seizing hardware, the vehicles began projecting the truth. Literally, pop-up holograms powered by mesh-charged microprojectors. Real stories, real data, unfiltered, unowned. People gathered in abandoned squares, watching the truth in light, powered by silence and sun. Then came the night the satellites went dark. Not all of them, just enough to make people wonder. GPS outages, signal flickers, emergency notices blaming solar interference. But the current kept moving. It had long since switched to ground-based positional logic. Peers shared topography and quantum map star alignments. The sky could shut down. The system wouldn't. And that's when the legacy powers made their final play. A task force, global, secret, codenamed Gridlock. Its mission? Regain control, disable the vehicles, crack the firmware, break the mesh, restore the hierarchy. They failed in less than 72 hours, because every node they disabled was instantly replaced by 5 more. Every line of code they cracked triggered a silent update across thousands of mobile cores. The more pressure they applied, the stronger the current became. It was no longer a product. It was an immune system. The old world had tried to centralize, and in doing so, had made itself brittle. This world, built from need, refined by scarcity, and scaled through solidarity, had become anti-fragile. And somewhere, deep in a desert where no roads remained, the girl parked her vehicle beside a cluster of others. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Their vehicles synced in seconds. Data passed, charge shared, maps updated. One of the older nodes blinked softly, then emitted a message, not as text but as sound, a rhythmic pulse, a song. No one had programmed it. It just happened, an echo of motion, the sound of life in transit. And across 1,000 landscapes, in every direction, other vehicles answered, quietly, steadily, together, because the revolution had never been about the machines. It had always been about motion, the choice to move, the freedom to adapt, and the right to live unchained. And so they moved, still, endlessly,